Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subs and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you all so much, I really appreciate it. And if any of you out there would like to take a couple extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you all so much for all your support. Oh, and hey, if you're new here, be sure you subscribe and be sure you leave this video a like. Thanks guys, it means a lot. All right, so for today's video, we are finally going to continue the story of the RMS Lusitania. When we last left the Lusitania, it had been approximately 5 minutes since the Lusitania had been torpedoed by German U-20 on the ship's starboard side. The Lusitania is rapidly sinking at this time, and the crew is desperately trying to figure out what they could do to save as many people as possible from the doomed Lusitania. Alright, well hey, with the intro out of the way, let's now continue the story of the Lusitania. It has been roughly 5 minutes since the RMS Lusitania was torpedoed by German U-boat U-20 off of Ireland's southern coastline and started to sink. On the Lusitania's bridge, Captain Turner is waiting desperately for the ship to slow down enough so he can begin to launch the Lusitania's lifeboats. On the Lusitania's boat deck, the crew is working as fast as they can to prep all of the lifeboats, because what the crew want to do is as soon as they get the all clear from the captain, they want to go ahead and have all of these lifeboats prepped, filled up with passengers, and ready to be launched as quick as possible. However, this was easier said than done for the crew working on the Lusitania's boat deck. One reason for this was because the ship was listing very heavily to starboard, so it was making it very difficult for them to prep the lifeboats. And the second reason that this was such a challenge for the crew on the Lusitania's deck is, believe it or not, the crew was short-handed. A good number of the crew members on the Lusitania that were trained in prepping the lifeboats were not on the boat deck. Now, in case you're wondering where they were at the time of the sinking, well, the truth of this is absolutely terrifying. So the reason the Lusitania's crew, at least those on the boat deck, were short-handed during the sinking was because a good number of the ship's crew were working in the Lusitania's cargo hold at the time of the torpedo detonation. And the reason they were in the Lusitania's cargo hold, which was located in the bow part of the ship, was because where the ship was due to arrive in Liverpool the next day, the crew were down there prepping all of the passengers' luggage. That way they would have an easier time unloading it the next day when the ship docked in Liverpool. And the only way in and out of the Lusitania's cargo hold was by means of an electric elevator. So when the power went out, all of the crew members that were down there, they were trapped in the Lusitania's cargo hold. I mean, I can't even imagine how terrifying that must have been for them. And remember, like, there was no emergency stairway or nothing. When the power went out and that elevator stalled, those crew members were stuck. And unfortunately, none of them made it out. They were trapped in the cargo hold until the water reached them. Now, at some point between 5 and 6 minutes following the torpedo detonation, Captain Turner told his crew that they could begin launching the Lusitania's lifeboats. He told his crew that the ship had slowed down enough for them to be able to successfully lower the boats away, despite the fact that the ship was still moving forward at a pretty high rate of speed at that time. So, if the ship was still moving quickly, why would he have ordered his crew to go ahead and launch the Lusitania's lifeboats, even though he surely knew the risks of launching the boats while the ship was still moving forward at a high rate of speed? Well, I honestly believe it was because from the Lusitania's bridge, Captain Turner could clearly see how fast the Lusitania was sinking. And I'm sure he was thinking that if they did not at least attempt to launch the lifeboats now, then there was a very good chance that the Lusitania would sink before any lifeboats made it off the ship. Now, when Captain Turner told his crew that they could begin launching the Lusitania's lifeboats, he also made a point to tell them to only focus on launching the Lusitania's lifeboats from the ship's starboard side. He told them to not even bother with the lifeboats on the Lusitania's port side. And the reason he told them this was due to the Lusitania's very sharp list to starboard. So, when a ship is listing, this can cause one whole side of the ship's lifeboats to be basically unusable. So in the case of the Lusitania, where it was leaning very heavily to starboard, this means that the starboard side lifeboats were leaning out away from the ship because that was the direction the ship was listing. But on the port side, and this was the opposite direction that the ship was listing, due to the list, this would cause all these lifeboats to swing in towards the ship. So if you tried to lower these lifeboats down, they would just hit the deck. You know, they weren't over the water. And if somehow you could get the port side lifeboats over the side of the ship and try to lower them away, well then those lifeboats would actually be grinding up against the Lusitania's hull. And if they're rubbing up against the hull while they're trying to launch these boats, then there's 1,000 things that could go wrong with this lowering away attempt. You know, these lifeboats could get snagged on the hull, and that could cause the lifeboat to capsize and spill all of its occupants into the sea. The boat could get damaged and sink when it hits the water. I mean, there's 1,000 reasons why you don't want to launch a lifeboat from the opposite side of a ship that a ship is listing. However, despite the fact that Captain Turner gave the crew this order, as the situation on the Lusitania became more and more desperate, a few crew members would try to launch some of the portside lifeboats anyway, despite what the captain said. It has been roughly 6 minutes since torpedo detonation. At this point, the water has almost completely flooded all of the interior spaces in the Lusitania's bow section. Now, as a result of this rapid flooding of the Lusitania's bow, this caused a momentary evening out of the Lusitania's trim. Now, I'm not saying the Lusitania completely evened out. I'd say her 15-degree list to starboard decreased to somewhere between 5 to 10 degrees momentarily. But while this evening out of the ship did help a little bit in launching the Lusitania's lifeboats, it actually caused a good number of the Lusitania's passengers to get the wrong idea as to the true horror they were facing. A good number of the Lusitania's passengers saw this evening out of the ship as meaning that the Lusitania's watertight bulkheads were holding and the ship was no longer in danger of sinking. However, they would soon realize that that wasn't the case. Over the course of the next 3 to 4 minutes, the full-on evacuation of the Lusitania officially began. It was during this time frame that the crew was doing everything they could to prep and launch as many lifeboats as possible. And yes, this includes the lifeboats on the port side of the ship, but more on that in a minute. Now, it was also during this time frame that more and more passengers were making their way up onto the Lusitania's boat deck. And once these passengers reached the deck, they were heading to whatever lifeboat they could to try to escape the ship on that boat. Now, one thing you need to remember here is the evacuation of the Lusitania was nothing like the evacuation of the Titanic, at least during the early stages of the sinking of the Titanic. There was a lot more chaos on the boat deck of the Lusitania than there was the Titanic, and this really is no surprise considering how fast the Lusitania was going down. Now, I'm not going to go as far and say that it was every man for himself type of chaos. There was some order on the Lusitania's deck during the evacuation. But still, when you compare it to how civil the evacuation of the Titanic was during the early stages of the sinking, yeah, the evacuation of the Lusitania was nothing like that. As all of these people tried to make their way up to the boat decks, they were running every which way, and the crew of the Lusitania was doing everything they could to keep order on the Lusitania's decks, while at the exact same time trying to prep and launch as many lifeboats as they could. And all the while, the situation of the Lusitania's sinking was getting more and more desperate. So, with all of this information in mind, as you can imagine, trying to escape the Lusitania in one of the ship's lifeboats was not a very easy thing to do. And honestly, it didn't matter if you were trying to escape the Lusitania on the starboard or port side. Both sides had their dangers you had to deal with. Now, granted, it was more dangerous to try to escape the Lusitania on the port side than the starboard. But hey, the starboard side wasn't that safe either. And in case you're wondering what was so risky about trying to escape the Lusitania on the starboard side, well, I'll explain. You see, when trying to escape the Lusitania from the ship's starboard side and get into one of the starboard side lifeboats, due to the Lusitania's very sharp list to starboard, this caused all of these lifeboats, when they were put onto the Lusitania's lifeboat davits, to swing out away from the ship. So what that means is, if you're standing on the Lusitania's deck and you want to try to get into one of these lifeboats, you would literally have to jump from the Lusitania's deck out over the sea and into this lifeboat. I mean, can you just imagine how terrifying this must have been? And depending on where you were and at what point in the sinking you were trying to escape the Lusitania, there was sometimes a distance from the deck to the lifeboat of around 4 to 5 feet that people would have to jump. I mean, I honestly can't even imagine how terrifying this must have been. Now, a good number of passengers were able to successfully make the jump into the lifeboat, but a good number of passengers also didn't make the jump. And when they attempted to do so, they tripped, fell from the lifeboat, and fell into the sea far below. However, if you consider how dangerous it was for the Lusitania's crew to be trying to launch the ship's lifeboats from the Lusitania's starboard side, well, I would argue that it would be near, if not completely impossible, to launch any of the Lusitania's lifeboats from the port side, given how far to starboard the Lusitania was listing. There were several attempts by the Lusitania's crew to launch some of the port side lifeboats from the Lusitania's deck. However, what this crew had to do first was muscle the boat over the ship's side and then attempt to lower it away. Almost every single lifeboat that was launched from the port side ended up capsizing due to the boat rubbing up against the Lusitania's hull. There was only one boat that was successfully launched from the Lusitania's port side, which you're seeing now in this animation. However, on its way to the sea, this boat ended up capsizing several times and spilled most of its occupants into the water. The boat was successfully launched, however, most of its occupants did have to swim back into the boat after it touched down. The occupants in this lifeboat were very lucky, to say the least. So, ultimately, how did the evacuation of the Lusitania end up turning out? Was the crew successful in launching a good number of the ship's lifeboats, and were they successful in saving a good number of those that were on board the Lusitania on the day of the sinking? Well, while it is true that the crew was able to launch some of the ship's lifeboats before the ship went down, and while it's also true they were successful in saving a good number of those who were on board the ship on the day of the sinking, as a whole, the evacuation of the Lusitania did not turn out all that well. You see, the Lusitania had 48 lifeboats on board, and with those lifeboats, the ship had more than enough lifeboats to hold everybody on board the ship without any issue whatsoever. However, due to the dire circumstances that everybody on board the ship was facing, and due to how fast the Lusitania was sinking, well, ultimately, the crew of the Lusitania were only able to launch 7 lifeboats before the ship went down. And of those 7 lifeboats, only 5 boats were launched without the lifeboats capsizing or having some kind of major issue during the lowering away process. Now, the 5 lifeboats that were launched successfully and without any major incident were launched from the Lusitania's starboard side. The other 2 lifeboats were launched from the port side. One of the port side lifeboats that was launched was the lifeboat that I showed earlier in that animation, and the other lifeboat that was launched, well, it was stored at the very back of the ship, and it ended up capsizing as the Lusitania sank. So, while this boat did float away from the ship capsized, it was able to save lives. Lifeboat number 2 that we talked about in the last video, the one that got stuck underneath the Lusitania's portside bridge wing, this boat did end up floating away from the Lusitania. However, the rain holes in the bottom of the boat, these holes weren't filled up before the boat floated away, or they weren't capped. And this lifeboat ended up sinking shortly after the Lusitania went down. It has now been 10 minutes since torpedo detonation, and the Lusitania's starboard list is starting to return with a vengeance. The vessel was rapidly leaning over to her starboard side. Also at this time, the Lusitania's forecastle, aka the deck above the ship's bow, was starting to submerge. Now, when the Lusitania's forecastle went underwater, the Lusitania's rate of sinking only accelerated from this point forward. Now, the ship was still moving forward by the power of its own momentum at this time. However, the ship was proceeding much more slowly than what she was before. At this time, the ship was moving forward at a speed of somewhere between 5 to 10 knots. Now, at this point in time, those still on board the Lusitania had to face a difficult choice. They could either decide to try to remain on the Lusitania and ride the ship down as she sinks, make an attempt to escape the ship in one of the Lusitania's lifeboats, or jump from the ship and try to swim away from the vessel. Now, I don't know about all of you, but if I was a passenger on board the Lusitania trying to escape the ship, and I saw all the chaos that was unfolding with the lifeboats as the crew attempted to launch them, then I would go nowhere near those lifeboats. What I would try to do is simply walk to the bow of the Lusitania and then just swim away from the ship, and then take my chances in the water. I'm sure that I could find some debris to float on, or maybe get into a lifeboat that doesn't have a lot of people in it and it's already been launched. That would be what I would do. But still, even if you're going to try to swim away from a ship, there's always the risk of not being able to find a lifeboat, not being able to find something to cling to and float on in the water, because even if you are a very good swimmer, you can't swim forever. You're going to get tired eventually. So what's the one thing that you need before you swim away from a sinking ship? A life jacket. Now, it is true that the Lusitania did have enough life jackets on board for everyone, but you see, if you were on the deck at the time of the sinking, you would notice that a good number of passengers didn't have their life jackets on. And this was because all of the life jackets on the Lusitania were stored in each passenger's stateroom. So that means that if you wanted a life jacket to use to try to escape the sinking ship, you would have to venture inside the rapidly sinking Lusitania, go back to your cabin, get your life jacket, and then head back up to the boat deck. And as you can imagine, there weren't that many people on board the ship that wanted to take that risk. However, I did find the story of one passenger and his mission to go and retrieve a life jacket from his cabin that I thought was absolutely unbelievable. The passenger that I'm referring to here is this man. His name was Dwight Harris. Now, Dwight Harris was so concerned about his safety during this particular voyage of the Lusitania, and he did not trust that the life jackets supplied to him by the Cunard Line were safe. So what he decided to do was, before he left on board the Lusitania in New York City, he went out and had a custom-made life jacket prepared for him, and he kept this life jacket stored in his stateroom. Now, at the time of the torpedo detonation, Dwight Harris wasn't in his cabin. He was out exploring the ship. And after the Lusitania began to sink, he hung out on the boat deck for a while. Around 10 minutes following the torpedo detonation, Dwight Harris made his way to a railing that was located just in front of the Lusitania's bridge, and was looking down from this railing at the Lusitania's forecastle deck. At this point, he noticed that the forecastle was beginning to dip beneath the surface. He decided at this time this was the moment to act. He had to do something now if he was going to try to save his life. But Dwight Harris also wanted nothing to do with the Lusitania's lifeboats. He considered those a death trap, considering everything he had just seen with the boats. So Dwight Harris slid down from the railing on the upper deck and stood on the Lusitania's forecastle deck. He watched the water slowly coming up the deck and thought to himself, okay, I'm just going to step off this deck and jump into the sea and swim away from the vessel. Now, keep in mind, at this time, Dwight Harris had not yet returned to his cabin to retrieve his life jacket. He wasn't wearing one at this moment. He was afraid to go back to his cabin to retrieve his custom-made life jacket because, due to how fast the ship was going, he was afraid of being trapped inside the vessel. A valid fear, if you ask me. However, just before he jumped into the sea, he thought better of it and thought to himself, I should probably go back to my cabin and retrieve my life jacket. So he walked back up onto a higher deck on the Lusitania and headed inside the ship back to his cabin to retrieve his life jacket. He commented later that this was very difficult considering how far down the ship had gone, and the list of the ship made it very difficult to walk in the interior spaces of the vessel. He was successful in retrieving his life jacket, and at this point he returned to the Lusitania's forecastle, which at this point was beginning to rapidly submerge, and simply jumped from the deck and into the sea. He said a giant wave showed up and began pushing him aft of the vessel. Once Dwight Harris swam clear of the Lusitania, he said he turned around and looked back at the ship. He said what stood out to him the most was the Lusitania's massive funnels as they slowly moved past him against the sky. Dwight Harris would end up surviving the sinking of the Lusitania. It has now been 14 minutes since torpedo detonation. At this point in time, the Lusitania's forecastle was nearly completely submerged. However, even at this late stage in the sinking, Captain Turner, along with several of his officers, were still on the Lusitania's bridge. Now, by this point, Captain Turner would have known for certain that the Lusitania was going to sink, and he knew it was about to happen. So he decided in that moment that he was going to release the few officers he had on the bridge and give them a chance to save themselves. However, before he did this, he asked one of his officers for one final readout of the Lusitania's spirit gauge. And in case you don't know what a spirit gauge is, it's what they use on ships to determine how much of a list a vessel has. The final readout of the Lusitania's spirit gauge was 25 degrees to starboard. Captain Turner could not believe it. So, once he found this out, he let his bridge officers go, and then Captain Turner turned around and put on a life jacket. Now, there was one officer who was on the bridge who saw Captain Turner do this and thought that Captain Turner was going to try to escape the ship with these officers. However, this didn't happen. Captain Turner simply put on the life jacket, and then he turned around and remained on the bridge. Captain Turner decided in that moment that he was going to remain on the Lusitania's bridge until the end. A short distance away from the Lusitania, German U-boat U-20 was still in the area, and on board U-20, its captain, Walter Svieger, was watching the sinking of the Lusitania through U-20's periscope. Svieger said that he could see massive panic on the Lusitania's deck. He saw people running every which way, lifeboats capsizing. He said it was massive chaos on the deck of the Lusitania. Svieger said in that moment that he wished there was something he could do to help some of those on board the Lusitania. Kind of an ironic thing for him to think about if you ask me, considering the fact that he was the one who torpedoed it in the first place, but whatever. Anyway, Svieger said he reached a point where he couldn't watch the sinking of the ship any longer. It was just too horrible for him to watch. So he stopped watching the ship through U-20's periscope, he had the crew turn the submarine around, and U-20 slowly left the site where the Lusitania was sinking and headed further out to sea. U-20 at this point was beginning its journey home to Germany. The time was 2:25 p.m., 15 minutes since torpedo detonation. It is now 2:26 p.m., and the Lusitania is beginning to drop like a rock. The Lusitania's forecastle is completely submerged, the Lusitania's starboard side bridge wing is also completely submerged, and the Lusitania's starboard side boat deck is rapidly dropping beneath the surface. On the Lusitania's bridge, Captain Turner, who was still on the bridge, walked upwards onto the Lusitania's port side bridge wing. He would remain here until the water washed him away, which was about to happen in the next minute or so. Now, as the Lusitania continued to sink, its starboard list continued to grow, until the Lusitania's port side propellers came clear of the water. Now, there was one survivor of the Lusitania who said that at this moment, he saw a man jump from the Lusitania's port side stern section, and as he fell from the ship, his leg made contact with one of the Lusitania's propellers, and the propeller sliced his leg clean off. This man fell into the sea, and was never seen again. As the Lusitania continued to founder, the vessel's starboard list continued to grow more and more until her starboard list reached a maximum angle of what is believed to be 45 degrees to starboard. Now, when this happened, this is when the sinking of the Lusitania became rather odd. And when I say odd, what I mean is the way the Lusitania foundered during her final moments was very weird when you compare it to how ships traditionally sink. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, I'll explain. You see, if you compare the sinking of the Lusitania to another ship, and let's just use the Britannic as an example here. Okay, so the Britannic hit a mine on the Britannic's starboard side, and the Britannic always had a starboard list as the sinking of the Britannic continued out, or played out, I should say. However, during the Britannic's final moments, the ship's bow went under the surface, and then the stern of the Britannic rose up out of the water a bit, and then with its stern sticking up out of the water, the Britannic slowly slipped beneath the surface. This is how you traditionally think a ship will go down. You know, if she takes damage on the bow goes down first, the stern rises up, and then the ship goes beneath the surface. However, the Lusitania didn't do this. The way the Lusitania foundered was very odd, and it's very different than what you expect a ship to do as it sinks. And in case you're wondering what the Lusitania did, well, I'll explain. Alright, so I want you to pay close attention to how the Lusitania is currently resting in the water. You can see that the bow of the Lusitania is beneath the surface, and you can see that the stern of the ship is starting to rise up, and you can also see the ship's massive starboard list. Now, at this point, you would expect the Lusitania's bow to keep going down first, and then the stern of the ship to continue to climb higher and higher up out of the water. However, this doesn't happen. You see, at this moment, the sinking of the Lusitania momentarily stalls. And then once this stall happens, the ship begins to drop like a rock. However, when the ship begins its final plunge, the bow of the Lusitania doesn't drop first and cause the stern to continue to climb higher and higher into the air. It's more like the entire ship simply begins to drop straight down at the angle that the vessel is currently at. And as this happens, the vessel's starboard list begins to even out. It doesn't completely even out, but when the ship disappears, they believe that her massive list to starboard had returned to maybe roughly a 5 to 10 degree list to starboard. And the reason they think this happened was, as the vessel continued to founder, a lot of her port side porthole windows were left open. So they think as the water rushed in through those porthole windows, this caused the vessel's list to begin to more or less even out. As the Lusitania slowly dropped beneath the surface, the last parts of the ship to disappear beneath the surface were the Lusitania's massive funnels and mast. That's another thing that I've always found strange about the sinking of the Lusitania, is that her funnels did not fall over until the vessel disappeared. They were the last parts of the ship to be seen by the survivors as the Lusitania sank out from underneath them. So, it's like I said, the sinking of the Lusitania was definitely odd, you know? She did not sink in a way that you would traditionally expect a vessel to go down, you know? She did initially, you know, she took damage at the bow part, the bow of the ship went down, the stern started to rise up, but then it's like once it reached this maximum angle with her stern sticking up a little bit, it's like the vessel simply just dropped straight down. So, my best guess as to why it may have happened like this is maybe the water just simply began to rush completely through the back part of the ship, and then that's why the vessel began to just drop straight down, because there were still a lot of air pockets in the top decks of the ship that were keeping the stern from rising up too high. I mean, it's just weird, you know? And then the porthole windows went underwater, so that helped bring the ship back to an even trim, so there was that factor, but regardless, as I said, the sinking of the Lusitania was definitely strange. But believe it or not, right before the funnels of the Lusitania dipped beneath the surface, there were 3 survivors who were swimming from the ship, and believe it or not, inside the Lusitania's funnels, well, at the time that the top of them went underwater, they were still dry inside of the funnels. There was no water in there yet, and this caused a momentary whirlpool to form, and this sucked 3 people inside one of the Lusitania's massive funnels. And when this happened, all 3 of them said to themselves, okay, this is it. We're about to die. This is it. And then just as they went into the funnel, something inside the ship exploded. I would guess probably a boiler. And then this eruption of steam shot all 3 of them out of the funnel. They were covered in coal dust, but they did survive the sinking. I mean, wow. I mean, you can only call that a miracle. There's no other word for it. These 3 survived the sinking of the Lusitania by nothing short of a miracle.
Then, just 18 minutes after torpedo detonation, the RMS Lusitania sank beneath the surface. When this vessel sank, it threw 1,959 people into the Atlantic Ocean, and of that number, 1,197 people would lose their lives when the vessel went down.
Alright everybody, well hey, I hate to do this to all of you, but I think this is the spot where we're going to have to pause the Lusitania timeline series for now. What's that? I hear you all asking yourselves. This isn't the last episode? I thought the ship had sunk, you know? Isn't the story over now? Well, yes, the Lusitania has just sunk, but believe it or not, guys, there's a lot more to the story. You know, I want to talk about the rescue effort, on how the survivors of the Lusitania were picked up and saved from the waters. And we also have to answer the question of, did Captain Turner survive the sinking? Did you notice I didn't talk about that in this video? Stay tuned for the next episode. And I also want to talk about the eventual fallout of the Lusitania disaster. You know, I want to talk about what happened in the world of politics with it, how the sinking of the Lusitania impacted the First World War, stuff like that. Anyway, guys, hey, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Be sure you leave this video a like. If you're new here, please subscribe. Oh, and hey, guys, if you did not know it yet, believe it or not, I have a family member who is also a published author. These books, The Tales of the Protectors Almost Heaven, and the second book in the series, Tales of the Protectors, The Elephant Path, well, believe it or not, these books were written by my very own mother. It's a young adult adventure series, and if you would like to check out these books, I will have a link where you can purchase these books in the description below. All right, everybody, well, hey, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a great day, everybody.
Special thanks to our captain level Patreon supporter, Dakota Charbonneau. Thank you so much for all the support, man.